Hi, I'm Phil Anderson and welcome to my channel. I've been a property investor now for over 30 years and I've watched investors continue to make the same common investment mistakes. There's so many dirty tricks in the real estate industry and it's all caught up in a whole heap of sales hype. I want to cut through that sales hype and help investors avoid the common mistakes. I hope you enjoy the following content, but please remember to like and subscribe. Welcome listeners and viewers across the country. This is another episode of Street Smart Property Investing, where we take a look at what's going on behind the headlines. And in particular today, we're going to have a look at strategies and what I believe is the single most exciting investment vehicle you can use in the property investment space. We've got a really great podcast for you today. We're going to delve into not just why this particular entity is my favorite investment vehicle. We're going to talk about how much balance you need, like how much funds you need to be able to get your hands on to make this work. We're going to talk about, why I believe every property investor should be investigating this particular strategy. We're going to have a look at some of the biggest mistakes that we see people making when they try to implement this strategy as well. Now, as you know, Invest Approved has been developed through thousands of property transactions. I take great pride in leading the group of 1,000 property investors, and over the years we've seen crazy mistakes. We've seen people get, sort of the dirty tricks within the developing space. We've seen people make all sorts of very common mistakes because they're so time poor, and they're also overwhelmed with, misleading sales advice, self-driven sales advice quite regularly. And, in amongst the whole, kind of barrage of what investors can be doing today, most people don't narrow it down to a strategy that's a great fit for them. So not only does Invest Approved try to provide a screening mechanism, a proven screening mechanism for the Australian property market, we also screen the property investment professionals that you need to bring onto your team to make sure you've got the support, because today investing is a team sport. You just can't do it on your own. If you're doing it on your own, my gosh, give yourself an uppercut, because it is just not practical anymore. The sort of expertise you need today, the team you need around you, it doesn't have to be overly extensive, but there are some really crucial parts of your investment team. And we're going to try and delve into, like I said, some of the strategy stuff and the reason why that team is so important. But to protect investors, I've been hand selecting the best professionals in, the real estate investment space, and I've been certifying them as Invest Approved. And I'm joined by two of those professionals today, and we're going to talk today about investing inside of a self-managed super fund. I'm joined by Mr. Self-Managed Super Fund himself, Mr. Peter Child Freeman from Freeman Financial. Thanks for joining us, Pete.
Thanks, Phil.
Mate, I'm really great. I'm really excited to have you on today. I've been hearing nothing but amazing stuff about what you do, your background and how knowledgeable you are and how genuine that passion runs inside of the property space as well. But your clients, mate, they rave about you.
Thanks, Phil.
And Gordon Ruddy. Now, Gordon Ruddy's from Smart Property Research, and Gordy's been a long time mate, investment friend. We've done all sorts of, layers of, sort of family stuff, investment stuff. We've worked very closely together over the years, and there's no one I would speak more highly of than this gentleman. He's got a heart of gold. He just takes every part of taking care of his clients to the ultimate level. He's got the biggest heart you could possibly imagine. So it was actually Gordy that introduced me to Peter. He said, mate, this is the guy. This is the guy we want to talk to. He'd been, developing a relationship with Peter, and that was what brought this together. Now, Gordy speaks so highly of you, and like I said, I've heard now from your clients, and I've been investigating this for, 6 or 12 months before, officially going, yep, we've got to get Peter into the team. We've got to certify him as a recommended professional for our investors to use. But Pete, please tell me, how did you find your way into financial planning in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question, Phil. And thanks for the introduction as well. So I got into the industry because I actually got some bad advice. Mm-hmm. So I'm a carpenter by trade originally, and I have not picked up a hammer for over 20 years. So I haven't worked in the building game for 20 years. I was working in the building game, and I got some bad advice from a financial advisor. And I went out and I bought an investment, and that investment was a failed investment, and I wound up with a tax debt. And as a result of that tax debt, I started learning about investments. I started learning about tax. I started learning about managed funds. And then while I was overseas, away from my environment, I stumbled across a guy, and he said to me, I was telling him a bit about my story, and he said, you should be a financial advisor. And I laughed at him. And at that time, the guy, he was the national sales manager for a small company by the name of AMP. And he suggested that I consider it. And as soon as I got into it, I loved it. And while I was going through the process of doing the study and integrating myself into the industry, my mum had cancer. And as a result of the cancer, she lost a breast. Her husband died as well. So along that way, she lost a breast, a husband, 2 cars, 2 houses, all of her savings, her entire estate. And I got to thinking, people are just not getting advised. They're not getting advised right. And I got into this industry because I felt that there were some fundamental flaws, and that in moving toward a profession that people just needed to be advised properly. So that's what I'm committed to.
Mate, it's a very passionate connection you have, and it speaks in volumes to, as to why your clients would speak about you with such, emotional conviction to how genuine you are in serving and protecting them. It's obviously you can see where that comes from now.
Yep.
Mate, tell me though, you got a deep history in the building industry. You're a licensed builder, is that correct?
I was a licensed builder. I'm still a licensed carpenter by trade, and I've got a restricted building licence.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So, mate, your passion and your connection to the whole real estate industry is certainly deeply entrenched, eh?
Yep, absolutely.
Gives you so much more knowledge with regards to, I guess, when you and Gordy are communicating about strategies and so forth, of course, having that understanding, and particularly how popular it is now to use self-managed super funds as an investment vehicle to buy investment properties. It's got to serve you very well. So, Mr. Ruddy, how are you today?
Doing great, Phil.
Now, mate, awesome. Yeah, that's great, mate. I know you and I got excited at the same time when we saw these laws change and the government give us the ability to use super funds to buy, to tap into our super funds to buy property. I can really remember us, having those early conversations. So what was your take on it back then?
This
is 2007, right? 2007 we first heard
so
about it.
Leading up to 2007, we had experience with lots of people were trying to do stuff with their self-managed or super towards buying property. And there was all kinds of schemes going around, and, many of them, not right.
Yeah.
So when this law was passed, it was exciting because it was I think the government must have realised that people needed to do something. They needed to give them an opportunity that they could leverage their super funds, but leverage it into something that's going to be secure, that they can bank on. And so having a legal, recognised vehicle to do that was a very, very exciting time. It was just, we needed to learn a bit about it, but you remember. We were actually right at the forefront with National Australia Bank at the time. I hope I can mention National Australia Bank, but they were
one of the first.
They're the first to do it,
yeah.
And I remember there was a little team got set up that was what they were going to focus on, and out of at the time was a modest. We weren't at 1,000 at that time, but I think we did the first 3 or 4 our clients did the first 3 or 4. Super fund lending with the National Australia Bank.
And I remember because the then boss of that department for National Australia Bank, I can remember him saying that when we put in, I think, 4 official applications that week for when you talk about the 1,000, that's our group of investors that, look to us to, steer them in the right direction and let them know what's going on. And when we put forward those 4 applications, and it may have been 5, but I'll say 4 to be safe, I remember that the gentleman said, geez, guys, this is so new. We've got one other application only on our desk, and you've just put in 4. This is the first 5 applications that we've received in National Australia Bank for self-managed super fund lending and their new product they just created. So we were very early. And of course, we learnt very quickly that, you can't bend the rules. You need to understand it, match it up, understand what's possible, match the property to perfectly fit. It's not the sort of, lending criteria that allows you to, bend the rules and twist things around because you've got a specific property that may not fit that you're trying to make fit inside of a self-managed super fund. So how popular have you seen it now, ever since then? How's it grown in popularity with your clients?
It's very popular with my clients because, and you see we're going to have a chat to, a mutual client of Peter and mine a little later on, and I'm sure Jenny will say that for her, it was a no-brainer because she's quite a conservative investor, but she realised that her super fund wasn't performing to give her what she wanted in retirement. So rather than, create a self-managed super fund and dabble in things that she didn't really understand, she invested in property. And for most people, for want of a better term, it's a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm. So dealing directly with, let's say, mum and dad investors, right? You're talking to a lot of investors, plenty of people that aren't necessarily, in extremely comfortable situations. They're just trying to figure out how they get their foot on the property ladder, how they start building towards, wealth in retirement, how they're going to avoid needing to live on a pension in retirement, all that scary stuff. And all those people that you're talking to, what percentage of those people are now open to the idea of investing using their super funds?
It's very, very high percent. I don't know the exact amount, but it'd been a 90% of people are open to it because they've got no control at the moment. They've got no control over what's happening with their super generally. The general public, it's just they put their employer puts their percentage in and they have no idea what's going on. They have no control. So this gives them some control over what's happening with their super.
Yeah, and I guess that's all it comes down to. If they have the ability, then they'll investigate it further. Well, it's a really good topic. And look, guys, I'm really excited to pull apart a few more layers of this. Do you want to start pulling away just a few strands of where I think we need to go with it? I think the viewers will be very interested in understanding a bit of an overview of what this is all about, how they can make it work for themselves personally. But, right off the bat, we need to let the listeners know this is just general information, right? This is just general advice. It's very important for the listener to understand that nobody wants to risk their super fund. No one wants to see anyone risking their super fund. And there's strict laws around protecting people from, the spruikers and all these people that are trying to get you to do things that just really aren't doing the right thing. So look, in the concept of understanding this, of course, I want to take everyone through this. I want to try and get some feedback from Gordon and Peter. But please, if this is something that really gets the listeners interested, excited, you need to seek independent professional advice. So take comfort, guys. We're just going to talk in general terms. The listeners now know that they'd need to get, independent advice before they went out and did anything. But I think this is something they should know. I'm so excited about this. This is my personal favourite investment vehicle. And I feel like every property investor should be seriously considering this. And if you can't do it today, you should be taking every step possible to set yourself up as quickly as possible to get this investment vehicle in place. That's how passionate I am about it. So, Pete, I'm going to start out with you, if you don't mind. Can you give the listeners a bit of an idea of just an overview of the self-managed super fund capabilities of buying an investment property, if that's possible? Just a little quick 1 or 2 minute overview.
Yeah, sure. So, Phil, I guess in the property space, and particularly where things are in the market, a lot of people don't have the ability to access the property market in their own name. They just, for whatever reason, they're not able to do that. But they've got this bucket of money sitting in superannuation that may or may not be passively managed or passively utilised. So what people can do is they can actually utilise this superannuation framework to purchase a property, and if they have a bit of a shortfall, i.e. there's not enough money to purchase that property, they can pool funds with other people and they can essentially borrow money as well to purchase that property. So it's a vehicle that allows people the access to be able to get into the market where they otherwise wouldn't be able to. And it's people that really like bricks and mortar. They can see something that's tangible and they can utilise their super to help them fund their longer term retirement goals. The other thing with the super space is it's a great tax structure. Most people believe or they have the misbelief that superannuation is an asset. Superannuation is not an asset. It is actually a structure that you hold assets in. So if you can use this special purpose vehicle to hold the asset, then happy days.
That's great. And one of the things you touched on then was you were able to bring together a number of people. And I guess the reality of this is that for the listeners that are hearing this for the first time, the functionality part of it is that they may have, money sitting in a managed super fund and their partner, significant other may have a balance in their managed super fund, and they can roll those funds together into one self-managed super fund. And I believe up to how many people? Up to
maximum of 4 members in a fund.
And so they can contribute funds together to bring their total amount up to a point that they have much more capability to do more in the way of investing with those funds.
Absolutely. So let's just say, for example, you've got a mum and dad, a couple. He's got 100,000 in his super fund. She's got 100,000 in her super fund. Now, this is very general advice, and we are speaking
general terms.
Yep. So they've got $100,000 each. So what they can do is they can roll that money together into one fund. They can have a family super fund. They've then got $200,000. They can then go and access a property that's, say, $400,000 as an example. There'll be some additional costs associated with the purchase, and they obviously need to have a buffer in their fund. But essentially they can then go borrow the balance of the money and access an investment they weren't able to access with the view to paying that down and having it paid off by the time they reach retirement. And then obviously the income is concessionally taxed later.
It's interesting because even just in that example, which is a very low leveraged example, we talked about $200,000 to purchase a $400,000 property. That's about as low a leverage, as we would see typically. Typically, you would be able to get more leverage than that with your super fund, and we'll talk about that a bit more specifically as Gordy chimes in, I'm sure. But the reality, even in that example of a $200,000 amount and a $400,000 property purchased in the super fund, if that property goes up by 10%, what's happened with your $200,000 deposit, it's gone up by 20%, right? Because you're getting leverage on a new amount. So the potential of leverage in your super fund, that's very, very exciting to me.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me about the balance. Like what, just so the listeners understand, what is the minimum balance needed to set up a self-managed super fund?
So essentially, ASIC, our regulator, they have a rule of thumb. And the rule of thumb is around 200,000 because there are costs incurred in establishing a fund and the ongoing fees of the fund. However, everyone's situation is specific. They may have a property that's actually fit for purpose that is essentially a lot higher than what their expectation is or a lot lower than what their expectation is. So if they've got a combined fund of around about 150, it's absolutely a conversation for them to open up having. And it's a strategy that they can consider. And if they can't do it essentially right now, there's some strategies where we can work with people to make sure that they can achieve it in a year or 2 years or 3 years' time.
I think that's important because when these laws come out, and Gordon and I and others were very excited about the potential of leveraging super funds, the potential of some other benefits that we're going to talk about as well. But the reality was that for me, I only had $40,000 in my super fund, maybe 44,000 give or take, right? Now, I was a self-employed guy. I wasn't contributing into my super fund. I'd had periods of time where I had, or I'd, had some employers, putting money into my super. But the reality was, at the age that I was, which is only 10 years ago, or maybe 12, 13 years ago or something like that when we first heard about it, I would have been, say, 40 years old then, right? And to have that sort of balance, it felt like a very humble, small balance to have, but I could see the merit. So what I did was I pegged my ears back, I talked to my accountant, I said, what's the most I can contribute, et cetera, et cetera. And, I just picked the target. And over the first couple of years, 2-3 years, I can't remember exactly the timeline, but I got the ability to put my first property into the super fund. So you must see that a little bit as well. Once they understand it and get excited by it, it's more a case of, okay, I know I've got to reach this milestone and that'll give me the ability.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a raft of what we call contribution strategies. So if someone's not able to access doing it now, and they've got a plan to be able to do it in the future, they can essentially put in contributions each into their fund over the course of a year or two to reach that goal.
Absolutely. So and that's part of my process now, is I'm very aggressive with every possible, in my overall tax management process that I go through, every possible dollar I can squeeze into my super fund every year for my wife, for myself, etc. I do that. Like I'm passionate about getting as much money as I can into my super fund, but I also see guys like yourself that are really tuned into this, looking at people when they're selling their businesses and other transactions that are happening in their life, where they're saying, here's a loophole, and there's a number of them that is very tax effective to put the money into the super fund.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just say you've got a couple, they can both put in $25,000 a year each and claim a tax deduction for it every year. And then there are other amounts outside of that we call non-concessional contributions that they can put in as well, and those numbers are significant. Obviously, we don't want to border on giving any specific advice.
No.
But they're quite endless.
And there's some big incentives. I know that for people that are downsizing at the moment, there's some incentives to roll, and don't quote me on this, I'm not the professional, so I'm not going to get in trouble. But the reality is, I think it's up to about $600,000 that downsizers can roll into their super fund and get some great concessions at the moment. A personal mate of mine that's just sold his business, he's got a big opportunity to minimise any capital gain from the sale of his business by rolling $300,000 into his super fund. So please, listeners, talk to the professionals. Think about every angle of when you're selling a property, you're selling a business, you're trying to minimise your tax each year. There are so many reasons why you should consider about getting that super fund in the position to buy, to consider buying properties as quickly as possible. Yeah, absolutely. So talk to me, Pete, just a little bit about, I hear some scary stuff, right? Like I'm out there talking to investors all day, every day, 7 days a week. And the amount of people that I hate to say have been taken advantage of by, the guys that see an opportunity in an investor that really doesn't understand anything about the self-managed super fund structures and buying property, et cetera, that charge exorbitant amounts to set up the structures, exorbitant amounts for the, advice and a whole range of things that, Gordon and I look at it after the fact when we're, talking to people that are, build a portfolio, then wonder why it's, not that well built. And we look at and pull it apart, and we see some of this data where we're seeing people paying, $12,000, $15,000 for this initial structure, and then these, just crazy costs. Can you help the listeners understand what's a practical amount to expect for the setup and the advice and everything to do with getting a self-managed super fund together?
Yeah, look, in broad terms, you can set up a self-managed super fund with a property, including all your financial planning and accounting fees, for somewhere between $5,000 to $7,000. And ideally, people don't need to pay any more than that to get it done properly. And honestly, there are a lot of people out there that are unethical, that are not acting in their client's best interest, and are charging exorbitant fees. to set up these structures.
Mate, the worst ones are actually basically the back door to a sales team. You know what I mean? That are really doing the structures. They've got the whole, basically they're a facade around developers' stock. Mate, I've seen some crazy stuff out there. The people are buying properties in estates that are, 100% investment stock. There's some really scary situations, unfortunately.
Yeah, there really is, and people need to be very careful about who they take the advice from.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing.
Mate, I think that's a really great place, and I might do a great place to hand over to Gordy. So, Gordy, of course, you're as frustrated as I am that, unfortunately, there's a lot of self-serving advice out there in this space, and there's a lot of people that are giving advice really as a facade, to develop a stock, and it really isn't in the best interest of the clients. I know that's frustrating, but dealing with clients every day and taking an approach of what would be the right property, the best property for that person to target, understanding their strategy first, their current situation, what they're trying to achieve, working with people like Peter to come up with this vision as to what's going to serve the client best. Of course, a jump-off point is going to be how much money do they have in their super fund. What's that going to allow them? What's their ability going to be to purchase an investment property? Because, as Pete said, there's no balance that's, you must have, but it will limit what you can do and whether it now becomes practical, right? So a big part of this is about the LVR that you can get when you go looking for the finance. Can you describe to the listeners what you're seeing, what you think is the most common deposit requirement as a percentage of the value of a property?
Yeah, the most common LVR at the moment out there is around the 70%, but that varies as well, depending on the serviceability. The bank might reduce that a little bit, which for a lot of people it's not a bad thing, to go down to maybe a 6% LVR, because it just puts the property in a much better gearing position to pay itself off sooner. So, but between 60 and 70 is what we're seeing mostly at the moment.
Yeah, we have seen it get up higher when banking criteria was different. We saw it up around that 80%. Of course, there's pros and cons to all of this. At the end of the day, when you can get leverage in your super fund, don't roll your eyes at that opportunity. It's still a very exciting thing to be able to do this in your super fund. And at 60 and 70%, we're still seeing some pretty amazing outcomes when you start forecasting it out.
Incredible outcomes.
And for somebody to, let's say they're using a 40%, no, let's say they're even using a 30% deposit. So it's at a, they're taking more borrowings. How long would it take for the typical person to pay that property off principal and interest?
The average we're seeing at the moment is about, at 30% deposit, is about 15 years. Just using the self-managed super fund, not having to put in, extra contributions into the self-managed super fund, just using self-managed super fund and the rent that creates from the property.
It's kind of a bit pinch yourself, because I've heard some investors kind of sit back and analyse it and go, it's a bit weird because they don't use any money out of their pocket, right? Then they buy this property and there's no pain to buying the property. It all pays for, the costs and everything get paid for out of your super fund. Then this property pays itself off principal and interest, and the investor's still sitting back going, hang on, there's no pain here. There's no cost to me. There's no burden to me. And it's a weird kind of thing for most investors, particularly if they bought in a previously bad way where it's been a terrible cash flow and a hard experience for them, to buy inside of a self-managed super fund. And because there is so much criteria around it and it must fit, it won't get allowed if it isn't a really good fit. If it doesn't fit, you won't be able to buy it. And if it does fit, most people just have this unbelievably comfortable, pleasurable experience buying and paying off a property. Crazy.
But that's exactly how it is.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is, if the property doesn't stack, the bank's typically not going to lend the money to the super fund.
That's it.
In any case. So it is really a bit of a no-brainer, because the bank's lending criteria has done a lot of the security screening before the asset is even purchased.
Absolutely. Look, the thing is, for people that get a bit nervous about this, the criteria is incredibly tight. It's incredibly tight.
Absolutely.
And the risk profile is incredibly low. So what everyone wants to do, or what the intent is, to make it so tight that it keeps reducing the risk of buying a property and doing something risky with your super fund. All of that is a little bit less sexy than buying outside your super fund and using 90% lending and taking out mortgage insurance and all these other layers, which gets higher and higher in the risk profiles inside your super fund. It's at the other end of the spectrum. You're talking residential housing, which is the lowest of all the risk profiles of all the different property types. Typically outside your super fund, you can get 90% lending, where you can't get that on industrial and commercial and all these other property types. So you're talking the lowest risk investment, property investment profile inside a super fund, which then pulls that risk down to a ridiculous level. So it's a well thought out, and I think it's for the average mum and dad, it's something that they can have a lot of sleep at night factor with.
Absolutely.
So one last thing, guys, and this is the big one before we have a chat to Jenny and we kind of bring in an investor and see how her experience has been. The big one for me, and this was kind of the icing on the cake. Now, of course, we've still got to also talk about how people can make some pretty terrible mistakes, and we're going to share those mistakes as well a little bit later on. But I think on the opposite end of the scale, the best part of this, the thing that got me, beyond the point of being excited, was the whole idea of the exit plan from owning a property in your super fund. Can you give us a bit of an overview of that, Pete?
Yeah, look, in the first case, Phil, we meet a lot of people that are thrilled and excited to get into the property market and to purchase through their super fund, but not a lot of them have even thought about having the end in mind. None of them typically think about the exit strategy. Well, how am I going to pay this thing off? And then once I pay it off, what's the purpose for it? And when people start with the end in mind and they have the right purpose and they pick the right property, which is a suitable property for their end purpose, then the benefits are even higher, because typically by the time they've paid off the property, they're in this pension phase of their super. And under the current laws, the tax paid on any income in pension phase is zero. So they can have this cash flow positive property producing a significant amount of retirement income tax-free.
It's crazy, right?
And if they've got properties outside of super, which they might have already paid off, or their equity's that big, they've got a huge, well, they'll pay capital gain. Yeah, if they sell that, then they're going to pay tax on a property outside of super. But if they decide to, well, we'll keep those properties, just let them keep producing income for us, they sell that one inside super, how much tax do they pay on that?
Zero.
That's crazy, right? That for me was like drop the mic and walk away. I was like, holy dooly. So you can take, the average, 50-year-old could use a part of their super fund to buy an investment property. That property pays itself off in 15 years. That 50-year-old is now 65. They've taken, just picking numbers, but let's call it $150,000 and bought a $500,000 property, give or take. That $500,000 property with 5% growth is worth, let's just say, $1 million at the end of that time, and probably comfortably, when you work at those numbers, everyone pick whatever number you're comfortable with, but whatever that $500,000 property's worth, let's call it $1 million, you've only used $150,000, give or take, to be able to purchase it. It's now worth $1 million. You own it outright, and that $1 million property, because you've gone into retirement mode, you can sell that property and not pay 1 cent in capital gains tax. My gosh, no wonder it's a must-have. For an investor, it's a must-have. There's so much great opportunity there when it comes to the tax incentives just on the exit part of it alone.
Yep, 100%.
Got to investigate it, right?
Absolutely. Got to investigate it. Got to have a look at it. Got to have the right team around you as well. Yeah, no, the team thing's a really important thing, because a great idea can go pear-shaped really quickly with poor advice. So you've got to have a great team. That's becoming more and more obvious in all aspects of property investing, but none more so than in the case of doing a self-managed super fund approach to buying property.
Okay, guys, what we're going to do now is we're going to cross over. We've got a very special guest today. I'm so glad that you guys suggested to get this lady on the podcast today. I think it's, it'd be great for the listeners to hear from an investor that's just been through this process, has just set up a self-managed super fund and purchased a property. So today we're going to cross over to our very special guest, Jenny Godfrey. How are you, Jenny?
Well, thank you.
Lovely to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Jenny, you're a busy lady, right? You've got your own business. Your husband's a minister of a growing church, a big community of people, and you've got twin sons and a daughter. So life must be pretty hectic, right?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, has been of late for sure.
So the whole idea of buying a property in your super fund, it must have been daunting. Take us back to the start. Like, where were you at the start? What were you, where were you in the process of thinking about, doing something in any regard, but particularly with your super?
Yeah, for sure. So I'd actually heard a little bit about SMSFs and purchasing a property in an SMSF and so forth. And Dave and I had purchased property before, so we kind of knew a little bit about it. We would consider ourselves probably conservative investors. And so having a property in our superannuation fund was kind of really, I think it was aligned with what we would normally probably want to do. So we then looked at the opportunity to, really went down that track to see what was available for us, what could we do to set that up.
Now, Jenny, I understand that through the process of understanding that and establishing the entity and purchasing the property, one of the reasons why we thought it would be great to have you on the podcast today is because you actually used Peter's service and you used Gordon to help you with the property. How bad are they really?
We wanted to be, to some degree, in control of where our superannuation was heading, because we knew in conversations with Pete that where it currently was not going to be enough when we retired. So we, went down that track of actually just exploring a little bit of that. What is our retirement going to look like? What do we want from our retirement? And Pete really helped us through that process. And then, obviously, with that big picture in mind, we need to figure out how we're going to get there. So that was where Gordon came into it in terms of helping us to actually purchase, a property in an SMSF.
Yeah, what a great combination, really. Obviously, I was a bit tongue-in-cheek talking about the boys that way because I know how strong they are and it's not common. Like I see a lot of people that dabble in a little bit of self-managed super fund stuff and obviously give property advice, but usually it comes from a very self-serving kind of, marketing perspective rather than a genuine perspective like I know Gordy offers his clients. So you really did find a great little team there to put this together for you. Was it fairly easy in hindsight? Did they make that process easy for you?
Yeah, they did. Look, we had heard of friends that had set up SMSFs, and when we started the whole process, there's absolutely no way that I would recommend trying to do it on your own. There's just so many different aspects to it. It's really quite complex. So we were super helpful. I was super glad that we had that help to be able to set it up. There's no way we could have done it. And it meant that we could just focus on I could focus on running my business, not take time out having to set all of that stuff up myself, and Dave could continue doing what he's doing as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that because it is a very complex entity. The depths of what Pete does and obviously Gordy understanding, what properties will match up with those very, strict requirements inside of a self-managed super fund. Some people take that for granted and make some really big mistakes. So for you to give over, the hard stuff and know that they're directing you in the right direction is obviously something that, particularly when you're already busy, it's a very smart move.
I know. It was a no-brainer, really.
So let's talk a little tiny bit about the outcome. Now I know that you've talked a bit about Pete helping you, work out a bit of a vision for the future and what you'd love to achieve, and making sure that I guess you've got that retirement kind of goal in mind and you're starting to do something very productive about it. How does this property play out in the scheme of things? Have you had any look at what the impact will be in the longer term?
Yeah, Pete, Jenny and I have looked at it and and being conservative with the with the forecast and growth, we use like a 5% growth, and the way Jenny and Dave have got it set up, it looks like they'll be paid off within about 15 years.
Great.
And it's totally within the super fund, not having to depend on income from outside. So that's going to be the forecast looks like they'll basically triple what they've got in the super now in that period of time. That's going to give them a nice income from that property at the end when it's totally paid out. And if Dave and Jenny decide it's the right thing for them to do at that time and they sell it, what happens, Pete?
Well, if they sell it when they're in pension phase, essentially there's zero tax.
How good's that?
It's a bit of a no-brainer.
Jenny, you'll be able to use a chunk of your super fund to buy a property and know that it'll pay itself off principal and interest over about a 15-year period. You know that you can, keep the main thing and continue on with your busy life as it is, and know that that original amount of money will be tripled by the time you get to even the earlier stage of potentially hitting the retirement button. You're still a young lady. But like I said, 15 years from now, that's a lot of leverage on your super funds. That must feel very comforting for you and Dave.
Oh, just to know that we've actually got some preparation for our retirement, absolutely. And I mean, that all really started early on in conversations with Pete, when we were seriously, figuring out what are our values, what do we want to do when we retire. And so to have something like this set up, ready to go, it certainly does bring that level of, comfort is probably a word I would use for that, yeah.
I think one thing that I drew on just then in my mind was the fact that Gordy talked about the 5% growth forecast, which is a humble growth forecast, but I think a practical one to apply. And there's got to be a feeling amongst families, and I ask you this, Jenny, to get your take on it, but there's got to be a feeling that it must be very unsettling for families to wake up and see that the stock market has had a big crash overnight, and things that happen so quickly. We've had a very unusual year, but we've seen it in our lifetimes. We've seen plenty of times where there's been economic bumps in the road, and the stock market reacts very, very quickly, and there can be a very big adjustment quite quickly to the value of the shares that you may hold in particular companies. So inside your self-managed super fund, it must feel like, I know as I speak to most Australians, they feel so much more comfortable about the strength of bricks and mortar as opposed to the exposure to investing funds in super. Is that something you and Dave have talked about?
Absolutely. As I mentioned before, we have invested in property before, so it was something that we were familiar with, and so therefore bricks and mortar in a superannuation fund is certainly a lot more, I think gives us a lot more, assurance. Having that bricks and mortar, I think, really does make a difference.
Why people like the bricks and mortar, Jan, and I appreciate you and Dave probably think this, is that it's actually a tangible thing. When people get a superannuation statement or whatever, there's that on face value, it's gone up or down, but you can't really see it, touch it, feel it. I guess the beauty of the bricks and mortar is it's a tangible thing. You know the property's there. It doesn't matter what's happening in the market, the economy, or the world. The property still sits on a footing. It's on a block of land. There's still a tenant who's going to continue to pay rent, and the asset's going to be there indefinitely.
The other thing that came to mind for me hearing you say that too, Jenny, is the fact that you are an experienced property investor. The gentlemen here have got deep backgrounds, long backgrounds in real estate, so they know how the property market, operates and functions. It's not a perfect 5% growth every year. It is a market, conditioned to market movement and so forth. But we all know now that it's reliable over the longer term. And because you're now taking a 15-year approach, you can take a pretty reliable approach to what the performance of the property is going to be over that time, rather than taking an approach of hoping that something's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years, some magic wand. So all in all, you can see why it's an investment of choice for you, but it is the investment choice for most people looking to do something and leverage their super fund, particularly if they've got, 10 or 15 years left before they want to hit that retirement button.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, so overall, how do you rate the guys?
Oh, it's been super helpful and it has put Dave and I in a really great position. As I said, for when we retire, we feel as though we're getting, well, I don't think we certainly haven't arrived, but we are working towards what's going to be a retirement that we know will get us through. And there's certainly an element of comfort in knowing that. And Pete and Gordon have been, instigators in helping us set that up, get ourselves into that position. Absolutely.
Yeah, look, I think it's lovely to have guys that have got a solid level of knowledge, but also intrinsically have really good hearts. They really do want to, see their clients achieve and they want success for others, which I think is a characteristic that these guys, no wonder that they've, kind of found each other and they formulated this pretty, powerful little, self-managed super fund unity or something like that. They're kind of the dynamic duo when it comes to that as a model. But I really appreciate you sharing your story, Jenny. We think you're pretty special too.
Oh, thanks.
No, thanks for joining us. It's been great having you on board. Any final things that you wanted to leave Pete as comments, mate?
No, I guess the most important thing here is that when we meet a lot of people, they've got this great idea, but Dave and Jenny have started with the end in mind.
Mm-hmm.
They've worked backwards. They've got a strategy that is essentially a retirement strategy and an exit strategy. And then Gordo's been able to select a quality property for them that meets their needs in terms of their retirement, giving them enough income so they can pay a pension later. And ideally, it's been great to be able to collaborate and put all the pieces together for you guys.
Yeah, that's really important because it is an investment vehicle, right? And people can go down the path of getting emotionally attached to wanting to buy a specific property, but not really understand whether it's going to deliver the outcome that they want. And in your super fund, it's got to be very much about what is your super fund going to deliver when you want to retire, right? So it is very important. That's a great point to end on, Pete.
Yeah. And with obviously Jenny and Dave have had properties, they own other properties now and have a strategy for those properties, but they've taken the advice of Gordo in terms of picking a specific vehicle for their super fund. And, you can't really, it's been great that you haven't worried about what colour the tiles are or exactly what the postcode is, because it is essentially a vehicle and you've left that selection process up to Gordo, who understands that.
Yeah, he's going to make sure you don't miss out on anything you should miss out on, but of course it's going to be square peg, square hole, which is, what's going to be the best fit for your super fund and for you and your family. Jenny, do you mind me asking you a little bit of a personal question? Can you kind of give the listeners a bit of an understanding as to how you brought together the elements and, your super fund, kind of structural balance? How did you bring all those elements together to give you the ability to buy a property?
For sure. So, obviously Dave and I had our separate superannuation funds. So we combined those together. And we'd received a little bit of inheritance, so we decided to put a little bit of that into our superannuation fund to boost it to what the minimum needed to be. And that was in discussion with Pete. He walked us through what would be a proper amount to put into that. And then Gordon went ahead and organised the property based on the amount that we were able to get in our super. And that was sort of the process and the strategy that was put together for us.
Yeah, it's great. So you've utilised what you need to have to be, to make it match up with what would be a nice, clean fit for this particular strategy. Then you just went ahead and put the parts of that jigsaw puzzle together perfectly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. It's been lovely having you on.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.
Take care.
See you, Jenny.
Bye.
What a lovely lady Jenny is, hey? It's always lovely to see, families, kind of that are busy and tend to get so distracted from doing something proactive about their wealth, take the time to set up a little pathway towards it, knowing their retirement's going to be okay.
Yep.
So, Gordy, before we go any further, mate, it's been bugging me. It's been in the back of my head. We've seen some crazy mistakes, and I think the reality of it is that, investors, as exciting as buying property in a self-managed super fund is, there are plenty of ways to make mistakes if you're getting poor advice and you don't have the right team around you. So one was coming to mind the whole way through this podcast, and I wanted to throw to you and see whether you go to the same place I do. Big mistakes that we've seen personally when investors have just jumped in and tried to take care of this themselves. What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I remember, a gentleman coming to us so excited, when the rules changed, and he did already have a self-managed super fund set up. Didn't get any further advice. He said, "I've got the self-managed super fund set up." He came to us and said, "I've just bought a block of land."
We're on the same path. I had the same guy.
Bought a block of land. I want to build on it, and I want to borrow some money to build on it. And we just went, shouldn't have bought the block of land.
You can't do that.
You can't do that. You can buy the block of land,
yeah,
but then you can't borrow money to build on.
You can't get a construction loan, right?
Can't get a construction loan in SMSF.
Yeah,
no.
so a classic mistake that people could make is just jumping in. It's the whole thing about just jumping in and not really knowing what you're doing. And in that property side of things, of course, exactly, what is, what the proper kind of investment vehicle needs to look like to be a great match for the structures of a self-managed super fund, and a construction loan just will not cut the mustard. You can't do it. They won't let that through.
That doesn't fit a square peg or a round hole.
No, that just doesn't work at all.
It
needs to be a one-part contract. It needs to be an existing property. It needs to be well thought out, and of course, part of your expertise is knowing, once you know the numbers and you've worked with someone like Pete to understand the overall strategy and ability, and you've helped test what the capabilities are of that investor or that investment vehicle. You then reverse engineer that all the way back to going, okay, now what property market, what property type, what price point, et cetera, is going to deliver all of those components to be the right investment vehicle for that self-managed super fund, but making sure that investment vehicle is also a perfect fit for the long list of legislation and criteria that's required for it to go into a self-managed super fund.
100%.
Yeah, mate, that's been a, the wealth of knowledge and the can't imagine how many dozens and dozens of properties now that you've had to coordinate for people in a super fund. And I know it's second nature to you, but you know that it's probably a fairly small percentage of properties that will actually be the right property.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Pete, from your side, what comes to mind for you when you think about the biggest mistakes that investor could make?
Yeah, probably the one that comes to mind the most is people setting up the self-managed super fund, but not getting advice on their insurance. So they'll set up a self-managed super fund and they'll lose the existing life and disability insurance they have in that existing fund, and now they've got a health condition and they're not actually able to get any new insurance. So they've lost all of that valuable life insurance or disability insurance that they need moving forward as a risk management strategy.
Quite often that's even the people that are looking at doing it are my age or give or take, right? And they're in a position where to go back and reinvestigate that, very rarely is it going to be as cost effective, or some of those insurance policies you can't even access anymore. So it's very important to even just think about that one component.
Absolutely, and a lot of the bigger super funds have got these things called group life rates where the premiums are significantly cheaper, and they've just lost that insurance now and they're never able to get it back again. So that's a big one we see all the time.
Mate, when you're trying to do something to protect your family and empower your family and give your family nothing but comfort towards the years that are ahead, one of the big things you don't want to do is affect your insurance in the process, because that's one you will lose sleep over.
Yeah.
And that all comes down to bad advice, mate. That all comes down to a lack of advice. It comes down to people that potentially, and we've seen it because we've seen, the sales entities that have somebody in an office somewhere that is processing the self-managed super fund structures so that they can then sell them a property and, whatever other insurances and parts that they've got as their overall checklist of things that they can sell the client. And that's what's going on. It's a sales team from top to toe, right? Regardless of what flag they're flying, it's really just, it's crap. It really is disappointing that mum and dad investors can be subjected to that sales machine that's all self-serving, and in the process, they're not even have their radar up to go, how can we protect them for things like insurance, in their current funds?
And unfortunately, they don't know what they don't know. And they feel like they're getting the right advice, and unfortunately, sometimes they're misguided.
Well, mate, the thing I know, and the big motivator for me in building this investor-approved model is the fact that even the sales teams at the moment, and I would say that, a very high percentage, 95% or more sales teams focus on really good strategies. They're focused on the good stuff. A lot of the expertise that's out there in the, in the space, internet, kind of a space of us being bombarded with content, a lot of those concepts and a lot of the strategies and a lot of the expertise that's out there is really quite good. There's a lot of really good quality stuff out there, but as much as the strategies and the overall concepts are really sound, if it's only a strategy to get you into a property or a product that they've already determined they're just going to corral you towards something that may not be the right fit, that's where the integrity falls down. That's where the problems exist, because they let go of the other things because there's no money in it for them, and they get hold of something that is a great story and a great product or a great strategy, and just, and 90% of what they do is probably, got the potential to be great, and in the longer term even work out fine, 10, 15, 20 years down the track. But there's way too much chance that along the way there's little things that self-serving advice creates other pain points for the investor, and insurance is one that would be easily overlooked.
Agree.
Yeah.
The biggest thing.
So, mate, it's great that your integrity is very much about, I know off camera we were talking about an example and we wouldn't dare share names or situations or whatever, but you were talking about one of your bigger clients that rolled a very big amount of money into a self-managed super fund to go ahead with a investment strategy, and as a client you work very closely with, but kept a number of other super funds alive because of the fact that you had to preserve insurances and other things that were very important that he would have easily overlooked. Yeah, so it mate, credit to you. Gordy, back one more, mate. The mistakes that we see investors make, there's another one that is unfortunately very common, and it is to do with the apartment markets. Can you share with the listeners why, we get really concerned when we hear about people using super funds as a deposit on an apartment, particularly an off-the-plan apartment? Can you explain that?
Yeah, this one particularly, upsets me a little bit.
He's definitely going to get upset. Don't think about it too much. You're probably thinking of specific people, and that's a sign of your heart, because you work so closely with people and you work so closely with families, and while some amounts of money on deposits on apartments may appear to be small amounts of money, to some families they're big life-changing mistakes that they make. So try not to zero in on the particular clients that you're picturing, but just describe what's very possible when it comes to apartments.
Well, possible, we know it's happened. People get excited, they get their self-managed super fund, then emotion kicks in and they go, that's an amazing apartment building. It might be in a particular location. We go, we can retire there. So they go out and whether it's the display unit's been set up or it's just a glossy brochure, whatever it might be, and the emotion takes over and go, yep, we can live here, we can use our super fund to buy this, and then we'll come and live in it when we hit retirement. So it might be a $700,000 or $800,000 apartment. They put down to $70,000 or $80,000 deposit down. By the time whether it's because the bank has changed their LVR, and I'll try not to think of this particular one, but it is a particular one, and it was I think it was $80,000, And that worked because at the time banks were doing 20% LVRs. And they said, well, that's okay. We can, we can cover that. And we'll be able to borrow the money.
It's not uncommon off the plan for an apartment to be, taking your deposit and yet you're not going to get that possession of that property for 2 years.
For 2 years. So that money's sitting there. And when
there's no unconditional finance. There's no
the contract's unconditional, but
yes.
you haven't got unconditional finance. So you're hoping that when the property's finished, you're going to get the loan.
Mm-hmm.
And in this particular situation, the criteria changed. There was two things: the criteria changed, then also the valuation on the building was less than what was purchased for when they put the deposit down. So it's a double whammy. So just lost $80,000 just like that.
Mate, it's sad. And it can happen even on smaller amounts of money. My memory goes back to a gentleman that was buying an apartment, a very affordable apartment, in Brisbane, in Fortitude Valley, I think, in that sort of precinct, and it was only a $480,000 or $470,000 apartment. Now he used 10% deposit from his super fund. His bank said, yeah, you'll be good to go. We love it. No problem. That's all good, right? So it was like, giddy up. And, 2 years down the track, the market had changed. The bank's appetite had changed. The bank was no longer providing funding for self-managed super fund, not even changing the LVR. They no longer had a appetite for lending for self-managed super fund. Now, this all became apparent to this gentleman 60 days or 90 days before settlement on this property, and he was telling me about his frustration in chasing all the different lenders that would lend money for a property purchase in a super fund. The 80% lending had gone down to 70%, and even potentially was going to go down to 60% lending. He went for higher interest on a product that was at 70% lending, and he was going through the process to make it happen and trying to squeeze as much money as he could together in his super fund to be able to come up with the numbers. And then the valuer stepped in and said, well, we don't think it's worth $480,000 or whatever. We think it's worth $420,000. So then there was immediately another $60,000 gap. Game over. Now, all of a sudden, this poor gentleman lost a big chunk for him, a massive chunk of what was in his super fund, and there's just nothing he could do about it. So, look, guys, it is important to understand that you need to work in a methodical order. You don't need to get ahead of yourself. You just come from the perspective of testing it first, asking the right questions, having the right team, getting the right advice, knowing before you do anything, is this a good idea for you personally? Would this work for me personally? And if it doesn't today, how soon could I make it work for me personally? What have I got to do to contribute towards getting this beautiful little investment vehicle as part of your retirement plan? And based on good advice and based on it being, the right fit for you and using the right team, how do I then match the perfect property that we know we can control all of those elements? We know that we're not locked in. I see you, Gordy, organising, properties for your clients, but if for a whole range of reasons, they never step across the line and become unconditional contracts. They're still conditional to the finance right to the very end of that process. Is that still something you can maintain? Is that still common for you?
Well, we have to. There's no way I could allow or stand by and watch a client go into a contract, an unconditional contract, without having their finance unconditionally approved. You couldn't put someone at that risk.
I hear plenty of people out there that are selling property and whatever that say, oh no, that's not going to be a problem, or that finance has been approved, or they got pre-approval or whatever. But we're talking about the fact that integrity wise, there's another level you can go to here, right? You can go worst case scenario through the whole lot of it and be thinking ahead of all the worst possible scenarios, which I know you guys in how much you care for your clients and protect your clients, you do that, right? So you go that extra 5%, that extra 10% and go, well, I'm not going to sign the contract if that condition says that, you know, it's conditional. It doesn't say that it's not conditional not conditional upon getting full finance approval. So even in the worst case scenario, at the end, the bank doesn't flip their whole approach and not give the finance. Guys, this has been great to catch up with you today. Thank you for coming along and sharing your knowledge, Pete. So it's Pete from Freeman Financial, if anyone's looking for great advice around the self-managed super fund lending. Any last thoughts before we go, Pete?
I guess the thing is you just got to collaborate. You've got to know that you've got a good team around you. And an example of that would be Gordo's quite often referred someone to me for self-managed super, and I've said, look, there's not enough room in this. So we go back to the drawing board and we find something that works. Mm-hmm. So you've got to have the right team, hasten slowly, have the right advice.
Absolutely. And sometimes that's a long-term approach, mate. When you really got the right team around you, they won't tell you what you want to hear. They'll tell you what you need to hear, and they'll help you understand why it'd be much better to tick a few more boxes or take a certain pathway to make sure you're going to get the experience that you really do deserve. So
that's a great way of describing it.
It's a real credit to you that you can see that, because that is, that is investing in your clients. That is long-term, relationships, and that's really what this is about. Because property investing is about a long-term approach, and the team that you have around you needs to be with you for every step of that journey. Last comments from you, Gordy.
I'll just echo what Pete says. You need to have that team around you. So if someone comes to me, the first step is it right for you? You know, it has to be. And, someone like Pete is the person to answer that question.
Yeah, good on you.
I'm not just going to sell them a property because they think it's a good idea. We need to know that it's a good idea for them.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining me today, guys. It's been a great episode of Street Smart Property Investing. Hope we'll get to talk again real soon.
Great. Thank
guys.
You.
Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to subscribe, and also feel free to leave me a question. I look forward to helping as many property investors as possible. Take care, and we'll talk soon.